Welcome. Today we're talking about a man who set out for one last snowboarding run on Mammoth Mountain. What started as a simple decision turned into an 8-day fight to survive in the freezing wilderness. He faced hunger, cold, and isolation, relying on his willpower and resourcefulness to make it through. To stay alive, he had to do the unthinkable. This is the survival story of Eric LeMarque. Eric LeMarque was born on July 1st, 1969 in France, but spent most of his life in Los Angeles, California. Growing up, Eric was drawn to ice hockey, a passion that stood out despite being raised near the sunny beaches of Southern California. From a young age, he focused on developing his skills on the ice, with a determination that eventually paid off. At the age of 17, in 1987, Eric's dedication led him being drafted into the NHL by the Boston Bruins. While this was a huge milestone, his career in the NHL didn't last as long as he had hoped. Despite his passion and talent, Eric struggled to adapt to the league. After just 3 years, he decided to leave the NHL and move to Europe, where he continued to play hockey professionally. From 1990 to 1999, Eric had a notable career in Europe. One of the highlights of his time overseas was being selected to play for the French Olympic hockey team in 1994, a significant accomplishment in his professional life. However, Eric's strong-willed and often difficult personality made it challenging for him to stay on good terms with his team. Over time, he moved from team to team, struggling to find stability. Eventually, Eric retired from professional hockey after the 1999 season. By then, his focus shifted away from hockey, and he found a new passion that would shape the next chapter of his life: snowboarding. Eric took to snowboarding with the same intensity he once brought to hockey. He loved the thrill and the rush that came from pushing his limits on the slopes. Snowboarding became his escape, a way to challenge himself and feel alive. But snowboarding wasn't the only thing Eric was using to chase a rush. After retiring from hockey, Eric developed an addiction to crystal meth. His dependency on the drug became a major part of his life, and he would often use meth to heighten the thrill of snowboarding. It was a dangerous combination, one that allowed him to stay on the slopes for long hours while ignoring risks. In February 2004, Eric went on a snowboarding trip to Mammoth Mountain, a popular ski resort in California. At 3,300 meters, Mammoth Mountain is the highest ski resort in the state. Eric was no stranger to this mountain. He had been there many times before and knew its trails and slopes like the back of his hand. With his confidence in his skills, familiar with the terrain, and the influence of meth, Eric was in his own world on the mountain. Later that day, a storm was forecasted, and conditions on the mountain were starting to change. As the day went on, the snow patrol began warning visitors to leave the slopes and return to safety. Eric's friends decided to head back to their lodge to wait out the incoming storm. But Eric, driven by a mix of confidence, arrogance, and high from meth, decided to stay. He wanted to go for one last run down the mountain before calling it a day. Instead of taking the marked ski slopes, Eric made a last-minute decision to venture into an unmarked section of the mountain. It was a risky choice, especially with the storm approaching. But Eric was sure of his abilities and thought he could handle it. This decision, however, would soon lead to a series of events that would change his life forever. While Eric was snowboarding down the unmarked section of the mountain, everything initially seemed fine. He was having fun, enjoying the ride, and feeling confident. As the sun began to set though, the conditions started to change. The storm caught up to him, and the mist began to settle around the slope. The visibility quickly dropped to less than 5 meters, making it nearly impossible for Eric to see where he was going. Eric tried to navigate back towards the designated trails, but the combination of poor visibility and the storm made it difficult. Every direction looked the same. That's when the realization hit him. He was completely lost. Even though he recognized he was off track, Eric wasn't too worried at first. He was familiar with the mountain and confident to find his way back. Combined with the false sense of security brought on by being high on meth, Eric believed he'd be fine and get back to safety without any real issues. As Eric continued down the slope, he eventually reached a flat section of the mountain. The fresh snow in this area was deep, and his snowboard couldn't glide over it. He tried to keep moving but soon realized he had no choice but to stop and take off his snowboard. Now on foot, Eric found it much harder to make progress. The snow was waist deep and each step was slow and exhausting. The poor visibility only made things worse. Eric started to walk in circles, and at one point he even came across his own tracks without realizing he had been going in the wrong direction. As the hours went by, Eric began to understand that his situation was more serious than he initially thought. The false confidence from earlier started to wear off, replaced by the growing fear that he might not find his way back. Eric wasn't dressed for an extended stay in the cold wilderness. He had on a shirt, a sweater, and snowboarding pants, clothing suited for a short trip down the slope, but not for surviving the freezing temperatures overnight. In terms of supplies, he had very little. A couple of power bars, some pieces of gum, a match, and an MP3 player. He had no choice but to spend the night in the cold with no proper shelter or protection. When morning came, Eric was determined to keep moving and try to find his way back. He started walking again, trudging through the deep snow with every step draining his energy. At one point, Eric thought he saw a pack of wolves in the distance. It startled him, but as he got closer, he realized it was just a coyote. The combination of fear, exhaustion, and the effects of meth was starting to take a toll on his mind. He was becoming more and more delirious, which only made decision-making harder as the situation grew more desperate. After several hours of walking, Eric came across a frozen river. Seeing the river gave him hope. He figured that if he followed the river downstream, it would eventually lead him to some form of help. But walking along the riverbank wasn't an option for Eric. The deep snow on the sides of the river made it difficult to navigate. Instead, he decided to walk on the ice, thinking it'd be frozen enough to hold his weight. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a huge mistake. As Eric stepped onto the ice, it cracked beneath him. Within moments, he fell through and plunged into the freezing water. The shock of the icy water was immediate, but Eric managed to pull himself out and get back into solid ground. Now, however, he was completely soaked, and the freezing temperatures made his situation even more dangerous. His wet clothes were a liability, as they could quickly cause hypothermia in the cold weather. Eric realized he had no choice but to remove his wet clothing if he wanted to stay alive. Standing in the snow, Eric stripped off his soaked clothes to try to avoid the effects of hypothermia, leaving only a boot on since he was unable to put on the other. This left him even more exposed to the elements, but it was a necessary decision given the circumstances. Now he had to figure out how to survive the rest of the day and another night in the harsh conditions with limited supplies and no clear sense of direction. With his wet clothes off, Eric had to keep moving to stay warm. He walked in circles in the deep snow, trying to keep his blood flowing. However, he soon noticed one of his feet, the one without a boot, had started to turn purple. He realized the frostbite was setting in, adding another layer of danger to his already dire situation. While Eric searched for water to stay hydrated, he remembered he still had his bag of meth with him. Desperate, he came up with an idea. He dumped the remaining drugs out of the plastic bag and decided to use the bag to collect water. The small but crucial decision marked an ironic turning point. At that moment, Eric unknowingly began the process of leaving his addiction behind. Without proper clothing or protection from the freezing cold, Eric knew he had to find shelter quickly. He decided to build a quinzhee, a temporary snow shelter made by piling up loose snow, shaping it and then hollowing it out to create a space to stay inside. While similar to an igloo, a quinzhee is meant to be a short-term solution and doesn't use blocks of ice. For the next 4 days, Eric stayed inside the quinzhee, using it to protect himself from the cold, wind, and freezing temperatures. To increase insulation, Eric collected branches and leaves, placing them inside the quinzhee, and even stuffing them into his clothes. Though it was far from comfortable, the shelter kept him alive. During this time, Eric noticed something concerning. The boot he still had on began to feel tight around his foot. He removed the boot, only to discover that the sock had frozen to his skin. As he pulled the sock off, chunks of skin peeled away with it. Frostbite was now spreading across his feet, making every movement even more painful and difficult. As the days passed, Eric ran out of the few food supplies he had with him. Desperation set in. With nothing else to eat, he began collecting pine nuts and tried to hack pieces of bark of trees using his snowboard to eat. The hunger became unbearable, leading Eric to take an extreme step, eating the dead skin that had peeled off his frostbitten feet. Though it gave him some feeling of fullness, the act was repulsive and unsustainable. He knew he couldn't survive much longer this way. By the 6th day, Eric was growing weaker. He tried to start a fire using one match, but everything around him was too damp to start a fire. Without warmth or proper food, his situation was getting worse. All he had left was his MP3 player, which still had some battery life. He turned it on and listened to his music in an attempt to comfort himself. As he turned the player, he noticed something unusual. The signal became stronger when he faced a certain direction. This gave him an idea. If the signal was stronger in one direction, it might lead him to help. It wasn't much, but it gave him something to follow. While listening to the radio on his MP3 player, Eric heard a news report about himself. The report stated that search and rescue teams were looking for Eric, but they weren't expecting to find him alive. They were now working to retrieve his body. This realization shook Eric. He was still alive, but people had already assumed the worst. At the same time, hearing that search efforts were underway gave him a renewed sense of hope. He wasn't entirely forgotten, and he believed there was still a chance to make it back alive. Unbeknownst to Eric, his family had grown increasingly worried during his absence. 5 days into his ordeal, Eric's mother became concerned after not hearing from him. She convinced her husband to go to the police and report Eric as missing. This prompted the start of search efforts on the mountain. While Eric had no way of knowing the exact details, the thought of people looking for him gave him a small glimmer of hope. Eric's physical condition continued to deteriorate. Frostbite had taken a hold on his feet, making every step agonizing. His body was weak from hunger, and the cold was unrelenting. Still, he pressed on, following the MP3 player's signal and clinging to the hope that he could find his way back to safety. The combination of hunger, cold, and isolation made it harder for him to think clearly, but Eric's determination to survive kept him moving forward. By the 7th day, Eric had spent an entire week battling the freezing temperatures and harsh conditions. His body was weak, his energy was almost gone, and his frostbitten feet made every step agonizing. Despite his determination, walking toward the signal from his MP3 player was slow and painful. Sometimes he could barely move at all. Each step drained what little strength he had left. Realizing he couldn't make any real progress that day, Eric had no choice but to spend another night in the cold wilderness. On the 8th day, as Eric sat in the snow, he wondered if anyone would ever find him. He had no idea if the search was still ongoing or if people had already given up hope. Just as despair began to set in, Eric heard a faint noise in the distance. The sound grew louder and he realized it was a helicopter. He scrambled to wave his arms and make himself visible, doing everything he could to get the helicopter's attention. To his relief, the rescue helicopter spotted him. He was 9 miles or 14 kilometers away from the resort. A rescuer rappelled down from the helicopter and approached Eric cautiously. The man asked Eric multiple times if he was Eric LeMarque. Exhausted and freezing, Eric nodded and confirmed who he was. The rescuer immediately began assessing Eric's condition before securing him for transport. Once Eric was safely attached, they lifted him into the helicopter and rushed him to the nearest hospital. As the helicopter flew to safety, news of Eric's rescue reached his parents. They were informed that Eric had been found alive after 8 days in the freezing wilderness. At first, they couldn't believe the news, but their disbelief quickly turned to joy. They were overwhelmed with relief and gratitude that Eric had been found and was still alive. When Eric arrived at the hospital, he lost 20 kilograms or 44 pounds, but his ordeal was far from over. Doctors immediately examined him and discovered his body temperature was dangerously low. One doctor commented that they had never seen anyone with such a low body temperature survive. Eric was placed under close observation, and medical staff worked to stabilize him and bring his temperature back to normal. However, the doctors soon delivered devastating news to Eric. Due to the extreme frostbite on both of his feet, there was no blood flow and the tissue was severely damaged. They told him they would have to perform an emergency amputation on both feet to prevent further complications. Hearing this, Eric felt a wave of sadness. He realized his life would never be the same again, but he understood there was no other choice if he wanted to survive. The next day, after his feet were amputated, Eric received more bad news. Because of the prolonged exposure and the severity of the frostbite, gangrene had started to spread. The doctors informed Eric that they would need to amputate both of his legs just below the knee to save his life. This news hit Eric hard, but he knew there was no other option. His survival depended on the surgery, and he reluctantly agreed to go through with it. Following the second amputation, Eric began his long road to recovery. The physical and emotional challenges were immense. Learning to live without his legs was a new reality he had to face. But Eric refused to let it defeat him. With time, he adapted to using prosthetic legs and worked hard to regain his independence. Years later, Eric returned to snowboarding, this time with prosthetic legs. His love for the sport hadn't diminished, and he found ways to enjoy it again despite his physical limitations. Beyond snowboarding, Eric also made another important change in his life. He overcame his addiction to methamphetamine. His experience in the wilderness had been a wake-up call, and he used it as a motivation to leave his addiction behind for good. Eric eventually became an advocate for others who had suffered similar injuries or faced difficult challenges in life. He shared his story to inspire and help people understand that even in the face of extreme adversity, it's possible to rebuild and move forward. His journey from surviving in the wilderness and rebuilding his life became a powerful example of resilience and determination. Though his life had changed forever, Eric found a way to embrace it and use his experiences to make a positive impact. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. I would really appreciate it if you can like and subscribe to my channel. I know my videos don't have the high quality that other channels do, but I do my best to ensure my videos are at least worth your while, and I aim to improve with every video that I release. I upload videos once a week every Sunday. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.